Next up is Rob Norman. As Global Chief Digital Officer of GroupM, Rob oversees the activities of the world's largest buyer of online advertising. Each year, Rob authors GroupM's Interaction, a publication which encapsulates the current digital ecosystem and is widely viewed as one of the most authoritative papers on the state of digital advertising worldwide. Please join me in welcoming to stage Rob Norman.
Thank you. I only want you to remember one thing. It's 53 weeks till the midterm elections. Hopefully that'll be relevant by the time we get to the end of this. You're going to prove something to you in the next 8 minutes. One is I can read. Second, I hope that I can write. Third, that I have no one to do PowerPoint or presentations for me. We're in a low overhead business these days. And what I wanted to talk to you about was the future and why, for some people, it might not end well unless we do something about it. Because generally speaking, people take comfort in the idea that technology-enabled disruption creates new opportunities. Despite the sometimes negative short-run impact on individuals and populations, the received wisdom is that the world adjusts, and ultimately, broadly well-distributed prosperity will be the outcome. And historically, at least, this has been true in a macro sense. After all, people live longer than they used to. Each generation, by and large, has been economically and technologically advantaged relative to its predecessors. And as members of the 1%, I include myself in that here, and I include all of us on a global basis, it's easy to understand and to benefit from an always connected, all access, everything available, anything world enabled by technology. But the disruption we're experiencing today, compared to the first three industrial revolutions, may be different, and maybe there just isn't a happy ending for many of us. And not just people in far-off lands, but people right here. And I'd like to suggest that it's not change itself that's the problem, but it's the velocity of change that makes things different. In physical transportation, there was an 80-year gap between the first passenger train journey and the first automobile. There was another 30 years after that before the commercial flight. And 30 years after that, Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon. 3 years later, Eugene Cernan stepped off the moon, and we've not been back. In the transportation of data, there was a 52-year gap between the first phone call and the first television broadcast, and then a 60-year wait for the first web page. A little under 30 years later, however, things have sped up. And maybe they sped up a little bit too fast for some. The acceleration in computing power, the availability of bandwidth and device distribution has created some of the most powerful enterprises in history. And in some people's minds, we have a new Seven Sisters. And for those of you that don't know, the Seven Sisters in the early part of this century were the oil companies that controlled 85% of the world's petroleum reserves until the early 1970s. But today, the Seven Sisters don't control the oil, they control the data. But let's be clear, these disruptors are winning with their ingenuity, not by a monopoly of natural resources or indeed by favors of government. What they've done is created convenience and access to everything, from information to goods and services, often at highly competitive price. But in so doing, they've created a double-edged sword, and they've transferred value and profit and income out of countless organizations and individuals and replaced it, by and large, with enormously narrowly distributed wealth. It could even be argued that their growth has been partly responsible for the broadly anemic growth, particularly in the Western world and the global economy, and with it, what has become the most inequitable distribution of wealth for 300 years. That's a problem. Growth needs to be distributed. And growth is rarely propelled by increasing the percentage of people employed in minimum wage service jobs. In the Amazon earnings announcement, the biggest percentage increase in anything in Amazon was the percentage of the number of people that was employed. It was rarely mentioned in the analyst's announcement that the reason is that that number grew because they were shop clerks and storage people in warehouses and Whole Foods. It's rarely propelled by most large enterprises cutting costs to satisfy a narrowly, very narrowly focused investment community. It's certainly true to say that in 2008, more people in America benefited from the drop in gas prices than were hurt by the fall in the Dow and the cost of their 401k. And it's especially perturbing now to read of stock prices rising on the back of massive job cuts. It's hard to see why that's a good thing. Think about this. The equity markets value just two disruptors, Alphabet and Apple, more highly than Ford, Walmart, the Walt Disney Company, and others combined. Only 60,000 people work for Google. 3 million people work for those other companies that I mentioned. Today, our most powerful institutions are often corporations rather than governments. There are only 2 countries with more than 1 billion people, but a dozen or more platforms or applications with 1 billion or more users. The friction of the old kind of change gave communities and societies time to adapt. That is not what's happening today. And increasingly, people fear that the current changes are taking many of us to a cliff's edge. And I have to tell you that it's very hard to adapt once you're in free fall. Ponder this. 5 million people work in retail in the United States. And for the record, more people worked for Toys R Us on the day that it went bankrupt than work in the whole of the coal mining industry in the United States. For now, Sears anchors the end of a mall. Sears is in trouble. It's in deep trouble. When the Sears store closes, foot traffic falls at nearby stores, the Sears workers and customers are gone, and other stores nearby cut their staff also. Macy's is at the other end of the mall. Macy's is also in trouble. Let's say the Macy's store closes. Without these anchors, the ship that is the mall starts to list. Once it starts to list, it sinks. The stores close, the restaurants close, the multiplex closes, the jobs evaporate, the parking lot's empty, the gas stations close, the value of the real estate collapses. It goes on, it goes badly, it goes very badly. If one mall goes, all the retailers and suppliers that occupied it have got one less node across which to amortize their costs. Everyone in this room is used to the narrative about the explosive value creation of the network effect. This is the network effect in reverse. This is the domino effect. The Union of Automobile Workers represented 1.5 million people in 1979. Today, it's less than 500,000 active workers and 900,000 retirees, an aging population relying on an ever-reducing population to fund ever-increasing life expectancies. Play it out a little further. It's been said that 95% of privately owned vehicles are stationary, parked, for 95% of the time. It's hard to imagine inefficiency on a wider scale than this. It's an open invitation to autonomous vehicles and the sharing economy, which is great for some, and progress, yes. But what happens to the aggregate demand for vehicles, to the people that make them, and the multiples of those people directly employed that contribute to that industry? What happens to them? And I admit it, this is a pessimistic view of the world, but not one that blames the bringers of change. Amazon, through its frictionless logistics, has enabled small businesses to reach large and even global audiences. The same is true of Google. Huge global training investments, business enablement through AdWords, and indeed through YouTube, and Facebook too, platforms on which countless small enterprises depend. Tesla has catalyzed what was really a moribund industry and may be eventually seen as the greatest contributor to reduce long-term carbon emissions. So there's good news because the great disruptors are also leading the great renaissance, but at a pace that legacy institutions can't keep up with. And if there's blame to be made, it's blame to be made on those of us that educate our children and prepare them for the future. And if there's blame to be made, it's to be laid at the feet of government and the officials we put into government. Because in government today, and it's no secret that politics almost always triumphs over policy. And so how can it be okay to disinvest in education at a time when the only alternative to learning is atrophy? As Governor John Kasich said only last weekend, American education does not serve the customer. The customer is the child who needs work in the future. How can it be okay to close borders and deny freedoms when only a diverse collective can create opportunity? How can it be okay to defund government programs other than the military? What does it say about us when the Gates Foundation is as powerful and effective in disease control as the World Health Organization? The optimist view of the future is that technology will unlock ideas and accelerate new product development that will re-energize manufacturing, create maker movements and sustainable food production, that it will fuse the imagination of people with the speed and intelligence of machines. We hope that progress will create new employment and new income and the ability for the many to pay for and enjoy the new products and services that we in this room benefit from. And all this is possible, but it demands that policy wins over politics before it's too late. Policymakers need to deal with the needs of today's industry, not yesterday's. It needs fiscal policy to address the reality of income and capital distribution, to create remedies without impeding entrepreneurial spirit, and specifically to enable job creation. In this room today are people that understand and champion change. Let's use our skills to help realize a future in which less people are left behind, and let's count down the days to the Thursday in November, the first Thursday in November of 2018, and make sure we all do our bit to address the policy issues that threaten to derail our society. Thank you very much.